It was the most dangerous lie ever printed on a playbill. Three simple words that promised security and instead delivered a tomb. Absolutely fireproof. On December 30th, 1903, this promise lured over 1,700 people, mostly women and children, out of the biting Chicago cold and into the brand-new, opulent Iroquois Theater. They came for a holiday spectacle of music and laughter, settling into velvet seats surrounded by marble and gold. They believed they were in the safest building in America, but they were unknowingly sitting inside a beautifully decorated coffin, and the lie that had drawn them in was about to become the very thing that sealed their fate. That promise was a magnet. On this Wednesday matinee, more than 1,700 people, a full house, packed the velvet seats. It's the week between Christmas and New Year's, and the audience is a sea of families. Hundreds of children, their faces bright with excitement, are here to see the popular musical comedy, Mr. Bluebeard, starring the handsome comedian Eddie Foy. For many, it's their first time in a theater so grand. They gaze up at the 60-foot-high proscenium arch, the ornate dome, the lavish private boxes. They feel not just entertained, but safe, secure in a building that architects claimed was the pinnacle of fire-resistant design. The management, eager to capitalize on the holiday rush, had sold hundreds of standing-room-only tickets. Patrons cram the aisles and stand 3 or 4 deep at the back of the ground floor. The upper galleries, the cheapest seats, are filled to the brim, a dense mass of humanity perched high above the stage. Every seat, every inch of standing space, is occupied. The sheer number of people creates a festive, communal energy, but it also quietly, invisibly, seals their fate. The lights dim. A hush falls over the crowd as the orchestra swells. The heavy curtain rises, revealing the whimsical world of Mr. Bluebeard. For the next hour, the audience is transported. They laugh at the jokes, they marvel at the elaborate sets and the beautiful flying ballet of ballerinas hoisted on wires. They are completely engrossed in the fantasy, utterly oblivious to the fatal design flaws hidden behind the theater's opulent facade. They don't know that the so-called fireproof asbestos curtain has never been fully tested. They don't know that many of the 27 emergency exits are unmarked, hidden behind heavy draperies, or, in some cases, locked from the outside to prevent people from sneaking in. They don't know that the building lacks fire alarms, sprinklers, or even a simple telephone to call for help. They're sitting in a gilded coffin, and the lid is about to slam shut. The second act begins around 3:15 p.m. During a musical number called In the Pale Moonlight, a spark jumps from a faulty arc spotlight high above the stage. It lands on a piece of frayed muslin drapery, part of the painted canvas scenery. At first, it's nothing. A tiny, glowing ember, almost beautiful. A stagehand sees it and tries to bat it out with a piece of wood. But he's too slow. The small ember blossoms into a fragile snowflake of fire, then another and another. The flames, hungry for the flammable, chemical-drenched canvas, begin to climb the scenery with terrifying speed. On stage, Eddie Foy, dressed in his costume, sees the growing panic in the eyes of the stage crew. He knows he has to keep the audience calm. He steps forward, his voice steady, and instructs the orchestra to keep playing. "Don't worry," he tells the crowd, his voice trying to project a confidence he doesn't feel. "It's just a small fire. We'll have it out in a minute." Some in the audience, believing it might even be part of the show, remain seated. But backstage, the small fire has become a roaring blaze. The crew makes a desperate, fateful decision. They try to lower the one thing they believe will save everyone, the asbestos fire curtain. This is the theater's ultimate safety guarantee, a massive fire-resistant shield designed to drop from the ceiling and completely isolate the burning stage from the auditorium. The audience watches, a nervous murmur rippling through the crowd as the curtain begins its descent. It's the moment of truth, the test of that absolutely fireproof promise. The curtain lowers a few feet, then shudders to a halt. It snagged on a reflector from a stage light jutting out from the side. It stops, crooked and useless, leaving a 20-foot gap at the bottom. The fire, now a raging inferno consuming the entire stage, has its opening. The illusion of safety has just begun to tear. And through that gap, a monster is about to be unleashed. The moment the asbestos curtain jammed, a collective gasp was stolen from 1,700 throats. Through the 20-foot gap, the audience could see a vision from hell. The stage was a whirlwind of fire. But the true terror hadn't yet begun. Backstage, in a desperate attempt to vent the smoke, a stagehand made a fatal error. He opened the large loading doors at the rear of the building. This act, meant to provide relief, instead invited the bitter December wind to rush in. The influx of fresh oxygen turned the blaze into a blowtorch. With the back door open and the stage's roof vents sealed shut, the superheated air, smoke, and flame had only one place to go: forward, through the gap under the useless fire curtain. What happened next took less than 2 minutes. A superheated ball of fire and toxic gas, a phenomenon modern fire science calls a flashover, erupted from the stage. It shot out over the orchestra pit and slammed into the auditorium with a deafening roar. A tidal wave of flame, moving faster than a man could run, washed over the first few rows and then, following the physics of heat, billowed upwards towards the dome. It hugged the ceiling, rolling towards the back of the theater and cascading down upon the terrified souls packed into the upper galleries. The lights in the theater flickered and died, plunging the auditorium into a terrifying darkness, illuminated only by the pulsing, orange glow of the inferno. Panic, pure and primal, erased every trace of civilization. The cheerful holiday crowd transformed into a single, shrieking organism driven by one instinct: escape. The screams were indescribable, a sound of mass agony that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. People surged from their seats, climbing over one another, all heading for the faint outlines of the exits. But the exits, the very things designed to save them, became the enemy. On the ground floor, hundreds of people from the main level and the first balcony converged on the grand foyer staircase. The wide, elegant stairway became a vertical tomb. People fell, and the unstoppable wave of bodies behind them trampled them, creating a gruesome pile of the living and the dead that grew higher with each passing second. The true horror, however, was at the emergency exits themselves. Many were hidden behind thick, heavy velvet draperies that matched the walls. In the smoke-filled darkness, they were invisible. Panicked patrons ran their hands along the walls, feeling for a handle, a seam, anything, but found only plush fabric. They were feet away from freedom and didn't even know it. Those who did find the doors faced a new nightmare. The owners of the Iroquois, paranoid about patrons without tickets sneaking in, had fitted many of the exits with complicated European locks known as bascule locks. These were not simple knobs or levers. They required a small, unfamiliar lever to be turned to retract multiple bolts at the top and bottom of the door. In the pitch-black chaos, with hands slick with sweat and the pressure of a desperate crowd at their backs, these locks were as indecipherable as an ancient riddle. People slammed their shoulders against the doors, clawing at the cold, unmoving metal, but the doors held fast, bolted shut by a mechanism they couldn't comprehend. Even worse were the doors that weren't locked. In a fatal design flaw, a violation of all common sense, many of the exit doors opened inward. The immense pressure of the crowd, a solid wall of human desperation pushing forward, made it physically impossible to pull the door open against them. A single person, 2 people, 10 people, they were no match for the weight of 100 others shoving from behind. They were pinned against the very doors that were supposed to be their salvation. In the upper gallery, the scene was apocalyptic. The fire and toxic gases had risen instantly to this highest level, turning the cheap seats into the deadliest. The heat was so intense it was inescapable. With the main stairs blocked and the side exits jammed, people grew frantic. They found a fire escape door, managed to wrench it open, and spilled out onto a narrow, icy metal platform. But the escape was unfinished. It led nowhere. There were no stairs down. As more people pushed from behind, those at the front were shoved off the edge, falling 3 stories to the frozen alley below. This narrow, grim passageway would forever be known as Death Alley. Inside, with the fire closing in, some made an unthinkable choice, leaping from the balconies to the main floor below, a final, desperate act to escape the flames. The entire catastrophe, from the first spark to the last breath, took less than 15 minutes. The fire itself was largely confined to the stage and auditorium, burning itself out quickly. But it had done its job. The Iroquois Theater, once a symbol of modern safety, was now silent. It was a pitch-black tomb, filled with the suffocating smell of smoke and ash, and the bodies of over 600 men, women, and, most tragically, children. The promise of absolutely fireproof had become a cruel, lethal joke written in the soot that now coated every surface of the once grand hall. The roaring inferno was over, but the grim accounting was about to begin. When the first horse-drawn fire wagons clattered to a halt outside the Iroquois, the firefighters were met not with a towering inferno, but with an unnatural, chilling silence. Smoke, thick and black, seeped from every crevice of the grand building, but the frantic screams had already faded. The silence was the sound of a battle that had been lost before they had even arrived. Their first and most horrifying challenge was simply getting inside. The main doors were blocked from within by a dense, unmovable mass. They had to break down secondary doors, only to be confronted by the same grim reality. The theater's patrons had created a human dam, sealing their own tomb in their desperate flight. Once inside, the true anatomy of the death trap began to reveal itself to the hardened firemen and police officers. The gas lamps they carried cut feeble paths through the darkness, illuminating a scene of absolute devastation that defied imagination. The opulent lobby was a tangled landscape of bodies, piled 6 to 7 feet high on the grand staircase, a waterfall of humanity frozen in its final, panicked cascade. As Fire Marshal Charles Musham and his investigators began their methodical work, the feeling of sorrow quickly gave way to a cold, rising fury. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a crime scene. They moved through the auditorium, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris, documenting every fatal flaw with meticulous, grim precision. The horror wasn't in the fire damage, which was mostly contained to the stage, but in how the people had died. The evidence was not written in flame, but in the final, desperate positions of the victims. They found them piled against the inward opening doors, their bodies forming a solid wedge that would have been impossible to move even with the strength of 10 men. They found them in front of exits concealed by heavy drapery, with scratch marks on the plush velvet where they had clawed, searching for an escape they couldn't see. One investigator found a locked exit door with a complex bascule lever. Clutched in the frozen hand of a man at the front of the pile was a small metal hairpin. He had been trying, in the dark, choking on smoke, to pick a lock that was never meant to be opened in an emergency. The door was a cruel puzzle box, and time had run out before he could solve it. Up in the death trap of the galleries, the scene was even worse. Here, the fireball had done its most efficient work. The investigators noted that entire rows of people were still seated, having been overcome by the toxic gas and superheated air in a matter of seconds. But the most damning discovery was in the narrow passage leading to the fire escape. The door itself had been forced open, but the alley outside told the rest of the story. Investigators looked down from the unfinished platform, a metal precipice leading nowhere, to the frozen ground below, where the first victims lay. They had been given the illusion of an escape route that was, in fact, nothing more than a ledge over a fatal drop. The absolutely fireproof claim was systematically and brutally dismantled. The famous asbestos curtain was found to be a sham, a flimsy sheet of asbestos woven with cotton to give it strength, which had made it combustible. The stage vents, which should have been opened to draw the fire upwards and out of the theater, had been nailed or wired shut to keep the performers warm. The building had no fire alarm box to alert the fire department. It had no sprinkler system. The so-called fire extinguishers mounted on the walls, brand-named Kill Fire, were discovered to be little more than decorative tubes filled with a useless bicarbonate powder, more a theatrical prop than a piece of safety equipment. The investigation uncovered a conspiracy of negligence, driven by greed and haste. The theater's owners had rushed to open for the lucrative holiday season, cutting corners at every turn. City inspectors had been bribed or were simply incompetent, signing off on a building that was a fire code disaster waiting to happen. The standing room only tickets had not only overcrowded the theater, but had blocked the aisles, turning clear pathways into deadly bottlenecks. The final death toll was staggering: 602 people. Over 200 of them were children. The city of Chicago was paralyzed with grief and rage. The Grand Iroquois Theater had not been a sanctuary of art and entertainment. The investigators' report made it clear. It had been a monument to hubris, a place where every conceivable safety measure had been ignored, disabled, or faked. It was a perfectly designed machine for killing, and on December 30th, 1903, that machine had been switched on. The public, now armed with the horrifying facts, was no longer just mourning. They were demanding justice. And more than that, they were demanding a revolution in safety, one that would ensure no one ever had to die clawing a locked door in the dark ever again. The city of Chicago didn't just mourn. It erupted in a firestorm of rage. The gut-wrenching details laid bare by the investigators were published in newspapers across the country, turning a local tragedy into a national scandal. The public demanded a reckoning. The theater's owners, the architects, the stage manager, and even the mayor were indicted. Though the ensuing legal battles would see most acquittals and dropped charges, a bitter pill of injustice, the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. The system was broken, and it had to be rebuilt from the ground up, forged in the flames of the Iroquois. The focus of this nationwide soul-searching zeroed in on one deceptively simple problem: the doors. How could a simple door become an instrument of mass death? Investigators and engineers obsessed over the images from the theater, the piles of bodies pressed against doors that opened inward, the tragic figures who died fumbling with complex locks they couldn't see. The problem was clear. In a moment of pure, blinding panic, the human mind doesn't have the capacity for fine motor skills or complex problem-solving. A door lock, in a fire, needed to be as instinctual as the act of fleeing itself. The solution came not from a committee, but from the mind of an Indianapolis hardware manufacturer named Carl Prinzler. He had been planning to take his family to the Iroquois matinee that very day, but had been forced to cancel at the last minute. The story of the fire and the locked doors haunted him. He became obsessed with creating a device that would fail safe in an emergency. The idea he developed was one of brilliant, life-saving simplicity. He envisioned a mechanism that would keep a door securely locked from the outside to prevent unauthorized entry, but would open instantly from the inside with even a slight amount of pressure. He designed a horizontal bar that stretched across the door. Pushing on this bar, the very same motion a panicked person would make when slamming against a door, would activate a latch and release the lock. The panic of the crowd would become the key to its own escape. He called his invention the panic bar, or the crash bar. It was a direct, mechanical answer to the horror that unfolded in Death Alley. The Iroquois fire became the single greatest catalyst for fire safety reform in American history. It was a brutal, undeniable lesson that could no longer be ignored. Within months, cities across the nation began passing new building codes, many of which are still the standard today. The Iroquois tragedy became a bloody blueprint for how not to build a public space. The legacy of the 602 victims is written into the architecture of every public building you enter. The requirement that all exit doors on public buildings must open outward, that is the legacy of the Iroquois. The glowing, universally recognized exit signs, often with their own backup power source, a direct result of people getting lost in the smoke-filled darkness of the Iroquois. Strict, enforced occupancy limits and laws demanding that aisles and exits remain clear at all times. They are a memorial to the people trampled in the standing room, only sections and blocked stairways. The revolution didn't stop there. Fire curtains in theaters now had to be made of pure, non-combustible materials and be tested regularly in front of the fire marshal. Automatic sprinkler systems and mandatory fire alarms became standard. The practice of locking emergency exits from the outside became a criminal offense. Safety was no longer a suggestion. It was the law, written in blood. The Iroquois Theater itself was repaired, renamed, and reopened less than a year later, though it was never able to shake the ghost of the tragedy. It was eventually torn down in 1926, but its true structure, its real legacy, was never demolished. It was rebuilt 1,000,000 times over in every school, hospital, and movie theater constructed in its wake. So the next time you're in a crowded space and you push open a door by leaning on a long metal bar, take a moment. You are using a device born directly from one of the most horrific fires in history. That simple, mechanical action is the final word in a story that began with a spark on a muslin curtain in 1903. It is the lasting legacy of 602 souls, a silent, ever-present promise that no one should ever again find their path to safety blocked by a door that wouldn't budge.